We're here today with Mike Croll, author of The Rise of Security. Well, a few weeks ago, we gave our team of reviewers The Rise of Security to read. Mike, what compelled you to write this book?
Yo, first of all, thank you so much for having me here today. I mean, writing a book is immensely hard. And then, a lot of people think, oh, you're an author. So, J.K. Rowling, Lee Child, someone like that must be making a fortune. The reality is, this is less than minimum wage. I could have been guarding outside a supermarket, the back end of Essex or something, and I would get more money than I would on this. For me, it's about knowledge and information, and it's about research, and it's about imparting the story of our business. And there's lots of books out there on security, on how to like a risk assessment, how to make CCTV, how to do executive protection. I don't think there's anything out there that really puts it all into context. I was always interested when I was a kid. There was no CCTV. There were no guards. What is that journey? How do we get from there to here? And then I thought, well, I need to go even further back. So I started looking at the Victorian period, the Middle Ages, going back to the Roman times, back to our origins on the savannah. And then it draws up to the sort of current day. Where's it all going from here? So there's a strong element of looking forward, the impact of technology, how we feel about security, and where I think it's all heading. So I sort of packaged it all together. And it's very exciting to be reviewed by you and your colleagues.
Well, they are peers, yes, and they're global security professionals. We pride ourselves on finding you the best here at the ASIS Turning Pages podcast. So, Rise of Security, it also kind of catalogs a journey that you've made through, as you say, from security guard, security officer, right through to running global organizations. Where in your career do you think, with hindsight, you would have been to have benefited from reading a book like this?
Let me rewind on this a little bit. I'm just conscious that not many people read these days. We get most of our information via TikTok, via YouTube, on little screens. If you're going to write, and if you want people to read it, then you've got to tell a human story. You've got to be concise. You've got to keep it moving along. By the time it gets to one of the a newspaper, I wanted to write something that was compelling and compelling I'm an academic. So this is a book that I hope my students will pick up. Think, actually, this gives us a really good overview. If anyone's curious on the outside, hang on, we got this monolithic security industry worth $500 billion globally now. How do we get here? And also I wanted to have sufficient for people on the inside. I think, I recognize that. Yeah, absolutely. Those are points that are salient to that. So I've aimed at a very broad audience. Whether it works or not, clearly your reviewers, the readers, the full test of that. Thank you so much for having me on the show. I hope they enjoyed it. I hope other people enjoyed it. It was hard to write, but the end product I'm happy with. And if it contributes more to our knowledge of the business that we all know and love, then I'll be delighted.
Well, let's see what they had to say. Hi, everybody. Welcome. Welcome to the ASIS International Physical Security Book Review. This is our second podcast in the series. Make sure you check out podcast 1 featuring Chuck Andrews and his book, Yes, Sir. We will feature a review of several physical security books or cybersecurity books or anything to do with resilience, crisis management, geopolitics, you name it, it's coming up. And the idea is that we're publishing books written by authors in our community, colleagues in our community. So let's hope that this helps you wherever you are in your security career. I'd like to think that this will inspire other budding authors and thought leaders and global influencers to have their own books published. The book we are reviewing today is The Rise of Security by Mike Croll. Here it is. See, I've been very busy. So everybody on our panel received a copy of the book and they've had plenty of time to read it. And what a read it was. And they've all volunteered to be on this panel today. Let's begin by introducing those fellows who chose to review this book. And they're going to tell you, first of all, just a little bit about themselves. So I'm going to start off with Farah Benes.
Yeah, I am Farah Benes, coming to you from sunny London.
I am the managing director of a security group, and I oversee and drive the operations of the company. My career has taken me across Africa, Europe, and the Middle East, although I am now fully UK based. I'm an avid supporter of seeing more women lead within the security industry. This is my second opportunity alongside Adrienne and Yo-Yo to review for this podcast. I'm very much looking forward to a dive into Mike's book as it is such an excellent learning resource, and I absolutely loved it. Farah, thank you so much. Let's go next to Patricia.
Hi, everyone. I'm Patricia Correas. I live in Virginia Beach, Virginia, and I'm currently working for a German manufacturer of outdoor power equipment. As a business process analyst, I'm really excited to be doing some new things that I haven't done in my past law enforcement career, which include looking at processes and trying to make improvements and enhance efficiencies. At the time that I was in law enforcement, I did spend 30 years with the FBI. I was domestic in the beginning part of my career, and then I moved into some international roles. And like Farah, I've also traveled and actually lived abroad, traveled to the Middle East, to Africa, to Asia, and have found new challenges and some very exciting colleagues wherever I've been. So it's really a pleasure to be on the podcast with everyone today.
Looking forward to hearing your insights around Chapter 8 and 9/11, Patricia. Thank you so much. Okay, Chris.
Hi there. I'm the Canadian in the group, so don't hold that against me. I'm Chris. I am excited to be here today. First of all, it was a great read. My role right now, I work for GardaWorld, which is one of the largest private security companies in the world. I'm responsible for leading the consulting and investigations practice in Western Canada. I really love the challenge that every day brings in this space, and it's why I do what I do. The work is really hard, and my brain often really hurts as we think through the complexity of, well, how do we keep people safe in our modern era? But I think fundamentally it all comes down to, that great security always starts with genuine care for people. That's the philosophy I work by. And if people are at the core of why we're doing what we're doing, which I think this book kind of talks about a lot, then I think our results are really reflected.
Thank you, Chris. And moving over next to Deb.
Hi, so glad to be part of this security podcast. I'm Deb Anderson. I'm from Omaha, Nebraska in the United States. And over my 15-year journey in security, I was one of those that kind of fell into it. I didn't come from a military background or a police background, and I fell into it, fell in love with it. I've done everything from global security to developing a CTPAT program to third-party risk assessments. I also was an integrator for a while. My current role now, I'm a security administrator, and I do both physical and cyber. And one of the things that I love most about security is that no 2 days are the same. Everything is always evolving and changing in this field and always to get better or streamline processes. And there's always puzzles involved, whether it's an investigation or trying to figure out a way to mitigate a risk or something like that. And you work with people all the time. So those are some of the main reasons I love security. And when it came to reading this book, I was very excited to read it because it talks about the history of security and why we do the things we do now. And I was very fascinated by that topic. And I will have to say that the bulk of my personal library at home is security books. So I do enjoy reading, and I do enjoy reading fellow authors like with Mike. So
Great to have you. Thank you, Deb. And last but not leastly, a regular, or so it seems, Adrian.
Hi, thank you. Yes, thanks, Yolanda. Adrian Bosch. I'm a security consultant at the global engineering firm Barry Appel. So I guess I'm the stereotypical security professional, having a military background. I've also managed security operations internationally for some global companies, and now I consult internationally in my current role as well. So I think I get to see different sides of the industry, but still being sort of a baseline for comments. I'm a security nerd, so I don't actually read other stuff. I only read security stuff. It's my absolute passion, and it's always a pleasure being on these podcasts and being able to share my opinions.
I think you're in good company in relation to the security nerd piece, because I think actually we're all a bit security nerdy. So here's the panel, everybody. So let me just start off. Let's kick this off. And Farah, I'm going to come to you first. the history of building anxiety and fear around crime in this book from the beginning to now is phenomenal. The book is packed from the very beginning with incredibly well-researched information. So we're going to start off with the beginning, the history of building anxiety and fear around crime from the beginning to now. On page 61, German academic Ulrich Beck, I hope I've said his name right, Beck described our world as a risk society, increasingly occupied with debating, preventing, and managing risks that itself has produced. It was quite a phenomenal read. But this has been going on through the beginning of time, since recording crime. What do you make really of how Mike Croll has demonstrated this over the centuries? Farah, coming to you first.
I think the example that you used of Ulrich Beck's The Risk Society concept serves as a really good starting point to understand that evolution of the phenomenon of amplifying anxiety. So Beck's theory resonates strongly with patterns that we see now in modern times. And as society has advanced and become more industrialized, there's this increased awareness and aversion to potential risks that emerge. So television's ability to visually portray incidents has had this really profound effect on audiences, sort of immersing them in the narrative and allowing them to really emotionally connect with events in a way that wasn't ever really possible before. And we saw this with tragedies. Mike Croll used the Aberfan disaster, where televised images of mourning and devastation evoked this massive collective empathy and fear. So these visual mediums, I think, due to their immediate and emotional impact, tended to focus a lot more on sensational events, making things that are really rare but terrifying incidents seem more commonplace. And I think Mike Croll notes that this really leads to a massive distortion in our perceptions because hard news has the ability to stick in our minds and fuel fear. And I think we can't ignore the role of social media in this either. So where television and radio broadcasts really, supercharged our emotional reaction, we now have platforms like Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, or X, it's called now, which have really made them more explosive. And everyone has become a reporter, so every single incident is completely amplified, irrespective of its actual gravity. And I think this constant barrage of information combined with a very human tendency to focus on the negative has exacerbated collective anxiety. So I found how he talked about media evolution combined with our human tendencies and how it's shaped our perceptions and our reactions to crime and risk over time really fascinating. I think this examination really serves as a potent reminder as well to really approach news and events with a very balanced perspective and also acknowledging the biases that might be at play.
So I have to say I had a bit of a light bulb moment. I'm going to come to you, Patricia, because if you go to page 28, Mike Croll writes that in the 19th century, the new middle classes were anxious to protect their possessions, especially having been spooked by the media, referring to what Farah said, believing that at any moment they could lose all they held dear. And then page 29, by the 1930s, burglary insurance was sold as part of a broader home insurance policy. Typically, within 40 years, almost every home had insurance. But this marked a set of what Mike writes as a symbiotic relationship between insurance companies and security companies. The insurance company talked up the risk of burglary whilst reducing the likelihood of a payout by insisting on security measures such as additional locks, windows, bars, which security companies were happy to provide. And I'm thinking, what's still happening today? But it was such a light bulb moment for me because as a result, householders were less likely to be burgled because they would need to be compensated if they were. And once the policy was taken out, it was inevitably renewed year after year. It was a brilliant business model still working to today. Patricia, what did you make of the history?
Yo-yo, to reinforce a little bit of what Farah said, and then I'll answer your question. There has come to be, I believe, in society today, an expectation of what we're going to see on the news. And what we don't want to know is that it's impacting our personal life and our families and our businesses and our companies. However, because this media frenzy and people turning on the TV and watching their favorite channel has become a mainstay of families and people, generally speaking, then we are in a place where we are constantly expecting to hear some of that. And so for me, that's an issue. And again, really being impartial when you're listening to the news, whether you're reading it or you're listening. I prefer to read it, but other people may want to have the visual auditory. I don't watch a lot of TV, and everybody has their preference. With respect to the insurance piece you bring up, again, the expectation, okay, we have Ring doorbells, right? We can see people who come up to our doors. We have all types of cameras. We have window guards on our homes and our businesses. And we're doing a lot of these things because do we feel that we are threatened? Maybe. Do we feel as if we are vulnerable to outside people who might want to take something from us or who feels that they're at a disadvantage and that it is their right to do so? Of course, it is not their right to do so. And so we have laws and but security comes in full view to react to that where we want to protect ourselves. And I think Mike did an amazing job, historically speaking, taking us through all the industrial revolutions that he carried us through from the 19th century, as you mentioned.
Thank you very much, Patricia. Let's come to you, Chris, for your comments.
Sure. Thank you. I think Mike did a pretty good job of unpacking this topic in the book, and I did really appreciate a lot of the comments that he made. Farah made a really interesting comment at the beginning of this conversation, talking about amplification of risk. And I'd like to add one more word on front of that. I think what we need to talk about more is the social amplification of risk. I think it's a growing challenge that all of us as security professionals have to wrestle with. I think the media and the echo chambers that people are in right now aren't helping, and equally being glued to our home surveillance systems, which are so easy to put in these days, is doing very little to reduce that fear that drives the security making decisions for a lot of people. And I'll give you a great practical example. I had a conversation with a young family who lived in a very rural community in Canada just this past week, actually, and they were very concerned about child abduction. And I could have taken an opportunity to try to sell them security systems and things like that, but instead took a very different approach. And we started as a group looking at the crime statistics and came to the realization together that this is a very low risk for their community. And why did they perceive that to be one for them? Well, because of that social media connection and the messages that they were being fed. And so I think what we're dealing with is a constant battle for truth. And I think the other thing too is that we've globalized our community. Instead of just being in a physical location with a small group of people, now social media allows us to have access to the whole world. And so the whole world becomes our immediate reality. And that's going to be something that we're dealing with for decades to come.
Yeah, absolutely. Coming to you for your comments, Deb.
I think Farah did a great job of covering everything that I found with the chapter, but I did want to add on that one of the quotes that you mentioned was that he was saying that our society is managing the risk that itself has produced. And I find that to be true because another thing he said was the more wealthier we get, the more risk aware we are. And as time goes on, the populations make more money, they're able to afford nicer things, more things. And then I think with that comes they're more concerned about the have nots are going to want what the haves have. And you'll see that, how do I protect this? Because now I'm really invested into this item and how am I going to go about to protecting it? And to add on to that with the social media coverage, I really think it's influencing our lives tremendously because a lot of people might say that what I see on the internet must be true. And I think that's influencing people and it may not always be true. So I think what Chris said, you need to take the time to do the research and kind of figure those things out for yourself.
Thank you so much, Deb. There's a lot of home truths, aren't there, in this book, Adrian?
Yeah, maybe just to get back to Ulrich Beck, just to get someone that can say his name correctly. I think one of the good things about the book, I think Mike really gives a very good history of security. And for those interested in reading the book, it's very insightful. I think in terms of risk in society, so first let's look at the impact on us as humans are looking for, when looking at risk, they look for a binary answer. is there risk, yes or no, which is wrong. And unfortunately, that we tend to motivate that binary response. Do you have a risk, yes or no? That's not the answer. There's a scale to it. What's the likelihood of it? What's the impact of it? Risk is not a binary thing, and is a measure of control. But in that risk mitigation, you sacrifice certain things. And the more risk aware we become as a society, the more we are sacrificing in terms of freedoms, information, whatever you want to talk about. It's really a sacrifice that we're giving for that perceived risk that might exist. And I think what Mike definitely does in this book is he creates questions on what are we willing to sacrifice. So apart from that, I think there might be from what you've just read, Yolanda, I think there might be a tendency to think that the impact of the insurance industry and the security industry, in a sense, if you read the book as well, might have been negative. But the security and the insurance industries have had a tremendous impact on society to make it a better place. I think one of the biggest advantages, or one of the in that relationship between security and the insurance industry, is that standards have improved significantly. From a security perspective, there's been significant improvements in security because of the standards that are required by the insurance companies. So there has been a mutual beneficial relationship, but ultimately the user has been the one that's been benefiting from this relationship that exists between the security industry and the insurance industry, in a sense. So I think it's important also to see that. But definitely Mike gives a very good history and view of the security industry, where it was born and the relationships that formed over time, but so did so many other things in life. So yeah, but definitely very interesting to see Mike's opinion on it.
I was expecting it to be sort of almost, because Mike's a very experienced security professional. He's worked globally. He's worked for government, Foreign Commonwealth Office. He's done everything, and now he's an academic. So he's a real all-rounder. I was expecting it to be a bit negative, but I didn't find it negative at all. I found it, I was kind of even looking for bias to see if it was. I found it incredibly factually backed up. I thought he explained really well certain terms and phrases for those people who might not have even come across it before. So it's a book that suits any level within the security industry, and you don't feel like patronized too, but at the same time, you feel like you're learning. Over to question number 2, then let's refer to chapter 12, Enter the Lawyers, Duty of Care, big issue. How does the book, Farah, depict the complexity around the duty of care concept, and how do these representations kind of resonate or contrast with our real world experiences and challenges surrounding this responsibility?
I found it interesting how he shows that duty of care is shown not as a static concept, but as one that has really evolved organically over time, mainly shaped by countless lawsuits and societal pressure. He notes the role that duty of care plays in maintaining accountability, but also emphasizes the shared responsibility between employers and employee. It's a collaborative effort. So, for example, while a company may provide safety equipment and training, it's the responsibility of the employee to utilize it correctly. So I feel like he also really highlighted the risk averse culture it can foster, which can sometimes be very inhibiting toward innovation and growth. So this portrayal of the shift from more instinctual security management to really stifling compliance processes. This heightened caution, I'm sure we've all seen, sometimes results in really excessive bureaucracy, escalating costs, and very often it just overlooks the most common sense solutions. And I think in the present era, we are really grappling with an increased demand for transparency and accountability, which is happening alongside a tug of war between ensuring safety and fostering innovation. So I think these escalating costs of compliance, insurance, and litigation are all real world concerns for many of us. I think it's certainly a thought-provoking and detailed look at the intricacies surrounding duty of care. But however, with any concept, the application and the implications can vary based on the context. So suggesting that a one-size-fits-all approach is really not feasible.
When has the security industry ever been one size fits all? I don't think it's ever going to be. Right, Chris, let's come to you next for your comments around duty of care in chapter 12.
Yeah, as someone who works in the consulting and investigation space, it was a really interesting chapter to take a look at. I think Mike does a really good job of talking about how outside the security industry, there's been this evolution of the risk assessment approach beyond just gut instinct. And I think he does all equally good job of suggesting that we as an industry need to do better. He makes a really compelling argument around the heavy emphasis for defensible data and really understanding risk in a quantifiable way. And I know we're going to discuss that more, I'm sure, as a group here. But falsely reassuring risk assessments are a real concern. And I think Mike brings that out loudly in this chapter. He's bang on. There's a lot of bad practice out there. And if we have any hope of fixing this as an industry, we need more standardization in the way we approach this topic. But with society being increasingly focused on reducing risk, this attitude of security is really thought provoking. And I think Mike really made me think about that in a meaningful way. And I think the underlying question that he's asking in his book, rightfully so, is, whether we'll ever hit a point where expectations from our publics or from the community exceed what we're even able to provide as security professionals. I mean, one of the great points that he makes in the book is we live in one of the safest times ever in human history. Our life expectancies have significantly increased, even in the last 50 years. Yet there's this disproportionate amount of fear about the world that we live in, but the data doesn't necessarily support that. And so I think there's a broader conversation that we need to have. And I think the solution, because Mike doesn't really talk a lot about solutions in his book, and I think very rightfully so, he points at things and says, hey, look here, look at this. But I think what we need to start, the conversation needs to shift, and we need to start talking as an industry far more about just the simplicity and agility that we need to bring to this discipline and getting back to the basics, really.
Chris, is Mike basically saying that fear is making money?
I don't know that I would simplify that argument that much. I think he brings some nuance to that conversation in the book. He definitely makes a strong connection between making money and fear, but I also think he also does a really good job of bringing evidence. And, even this whole idea in the future of being able to use heart rate as potentially a metric of security effectiveness. And so there's this effectiveness piece that goes there. And if you're actually looking at risk assessment in a really strong and ethical way, we need to be advocating for the risk and opportunities, not for the sale.
Yeah, good point. Well said, if I don't
Thank
mind
you.
me saying. But Patricia, what did the duty of care chapter mean to you?
I was excited to read about duty of care in Mike's book because I have experienced it on both sides when I was both working for the FBI as well as when I went corporate. And particularly on the corporate side, there's no question that duty of care is a shared responsibility, to echo Farah. And I think that when, as a security manager and as a security leader, it is so important to work across the departments and make sure, starting with the C suite, that they support that. And I was very lucky that the C suite in the company I was working for in Atlanta, they did support it and they offered a wide range of things that we could do as a security manager. And if I was managing our work in Russia and people were traveling to Russia, I could support it. So, how has it evolved? Well, it has evolved because, to someone's point earlier, I believe Chris mentioned, or you may have mentioned, Yolanda, about the lawsuits. If people do not have the resources available, that's problem number one, right? If the resources are available and then the people don't use them, that can also, again, create a problem, especially because the risk environment, in my opinion, has become more hostile. When I traveled to Iraq and led a team in Iraq, we all needed to make sure that we understood the risk. And then we also needed to be responsible for ourselves, our behavior, our actions. And that was a great experience for me. learning how to support a team and also take care of myself at the same time.
Deb, tell me what your thoughts are on this subject because it's quite impactful across a whole broad range of sectors, isn't it?
Yes, it is. Thanks, Yo-Yo. This happened to be one of my favorite chapters because I've been doing a lot of research and work with duty of care lately and exploring the fact that with the new hybrid work environment, duty of care has had to be adapted and re-examined and looked at how the remote workers are they aware of the resources that are available? And they might be aware of them, but do they know how to use them? Do they know what to do with them when they're in this new environment? So this is a very timely chapter that I foresee it evolving and continuing to get bigger. One of the pieces from that chapter that I really found interesting was when he said this duty of care was and is a vehicle for defining security measures and responsibilities in a range of circumstances. And I think in the back of all of our minds, when we're developing procedures or examining circumstances, we need to keep that because another line that he said, which I thought was great, was security is protecting people from people, safety is protecting people from things. And in the realm of duty of care, it kind of straddles both those universes of safety and security. So you're developing your processes, you're protecting your people, you're protecting your things. You have to consider all of that because at the end of the day, if duty of care isn't followed, that's when the lawyers get hungry and get involved. You could see lawsuits creep up. You could see different types of regulations evolving and changing in that. And another piece that I've discovered as well with duty of care is that it doesn't matter what state you work in, each state has their own regulations to follow. It's the same with countries. Each country has their own regulations. So that's where the complexity of duty of care seems to fall into place, where it differs on where you are and what policies and procedures that your companies have. So I was visiting with a colleague of mine the other day who has a company that straddles several different states. And I said, so if, Nebraska and Iowa have different laws and then your company has regulations, which ones do you follow? And he says, we have to do it all. We have to follow it both. So it makes our jobs a lot more interesting when it comes to duty of care. Another piece I wanted to bring up about it, again, going back to the lawyers that he mentioned, was that the security practitioners asking, we need to upgrade the system because the equipment's old, or we need to update the system because there's new technology out there that's going to help keep our people safe and our processes safe. Well, they're gonna say, "Oh, I don't have that in the budget." They just see the numbers. They just see that you're asking for a new shiny thing. But when a lawyer brings it up and mentions to the fact to the CEO, well, if you don't upgrade the system, you're gonna open yourself up to, maybe some brand issues. There's exposure to financial issues, legal issues, and ethical risks. Then the CEO tends to open up. So when you bring in that holistic approach to presenting duty of care, I think you get more buy-in and more understanding. The last thing I wanted to point out about duty of care is this was and is still a huge driver of risk appetite.
Yeah, and I think America is known now to be one of the most litigious countries around the world. I know Mike makes a reference to that in his book, and the UK not far behind, which is great. Timely segue to come to you, Adrian.
I think Mike was gut-wrenchingly honest. I think what we've discussed now, and I think what everyone has alluded to is that at the moment it's more legal being pushed to the foreground. Duty of care should be an ethical-based duty, but it's now becoming something that's more legally applied onto the person. So the risk, and I think in a sense, Mike does point to it, is that it can go overboard. If I'm going to use the example of a pizza box that says, be careful, don't eat the box. So the problem, if it becomes solely a legal aspect, is that you lose balance in a sense. So I think he makes a point as well in terms of the terrorist threat, where, especially in the UK, where he makes the point to say, listen, the chances of you being killed by a horse or a cow is just as likely as being killed by a terrorist. But what is the balance between the expenditure and the fear that's around it? And so I actually, one of the other readings I did with this was I went to the Diagnostic and Statistics Manual of Mental Disorders. That's basically the Bible for the American Psychiatric Association. And they make the point that when a risk is from a human being, we tend to overreact to it. It gives more physical and long-lasting psychiatric damage to us. So that fear of another person is exceptionally higher than a fear of a specific thing. And like Deborah just said, that's the difference between security and safety. It's something that comes from a person. So the challenge will be for us as a society in the future is how do we get this balance? What is a person's duty and what is a company's duty? For those that manage travel risk management plans, there's always going to be a duty from the actual person traveling not to do stupid things or to abide by a certain set of rules. And the question will be, will the legal jargon support that mutual supportive actions that need to happen to keep everyone safe? So that's the danger that the red lights that are flashing. Mike picks it up. It definitely speaks about it. I think it's one of the reasons I would definitely recommend this book is really getting that gut wrenching, honest view of what is duty. So yeah, big challenge for us as a society going forward.
Thank you, Adrian. Right, let's go over to the third subject that we're going to bring up. And it's a nice segue, actually, in relation to terrorism. Chapter 8 and 9, I actually had a lot of fun in this area because I had a lot of light bulb moments. Quite happy to admit it. There's nothing like having a suspicion about how you think something's happened or how you think the narrative has been behind the scenes and then having that realized. And I think that's why I had quite a few of those realizations. Let's just go to this section here that I've got. It's page 115. It's something that I will always remember. If we were to scrutinize the data, Mike Croll writes, we would weigh our options more carefully. In their 2011 book, academic John Mueller and Mark Stewart estimated that between 1970 and 2007, Americans had a 1 in 3.5 million chance of being killed in a terrorist attack, a 1 in 950,000 chance of drowning in a bathtub, a 1 in 22,000 chance of being murdered, and a 1 in 8,200 chance of being killed in a road crash. Of course, it's how you die that's important. For politicians, risk isn't a function of impact and likelihood. It's a function of impact and outrage. A single death at the hands of a terrorist will mobilize more media and more political attention and create a greater sense of insecurity than any number of deaths on the road or in a bathtub. Now, we saw a significant shift in the US security landscape. Sarah, I'm going to come to you first. With a marked increase in technological advancements and implementations, huge amounts of investment. How does Mike reflect in the book or discuss this sort of transformative period? And can we draw parallels as well in this sort of post 9/11 evolution in security and the subsequent rise of security services and automation, certainly in what is now our post-COVID world? Farah, what are your views on that?
Found the way that Mike looked at the heightened focus on security after 9/11 terrorist attacks really fascinating, especially going through technological advancements and implementations that emerged as part of the US security landscape. I think the book really explores the relationship between public fear and technological adoption, in how after 9/11, there was this acceptance, if not eagerness, to embrace technology as the promise to enhance national security, even if it came at the cost of individual privacy. And I think this willingness to compromise is really rooted in the desire for safety, even if the actual threats, as he elaborates in chapter 9, are not always proportional to the public's perception. So Adrian mentioned a quote. The same quote that he mentioned goes on to say, around 160,000 in the UK die of heart disease annually. So you are 35,000 times more likely to die because of your lifestyle choices than in a terrorist attack. So drawing parallels to that with the post-COVID world, I think we witness a similar pattern. Just as the aftermath of 9/11 ushered in this era of security overdrive, the pandemic really brought in its way a host of technological solutions that were aimed at monitoring, controlling, and preventing health crisis. But the rapid adoption of contact tracing apps, temperature scanning apps, or health status verification, it really mirrors that post 9/11 urgency to integrate technology into our daily lives in the name of security. So I think this book really provides a blueprint for understanding how societies respond to large scale crisis. Both COVID and 9/11 marked a transformative phase where fear driven by real events catalyzed societal and technological shifts, sometimes at the cost of personal freedom.
Yes, it was definitely. And we've all lived through that, haven't we? But you said one of the quotes there, which is a phenomenal quote. And I think another reason why I like Mike's book is that he's gone away and done all this research and provided all of the tasty information all in one place. And here is another one. I'm going to come to you, Patricia, after I've read this quote. And this quote basically says, it's therefore worth taking note that this is page 116, again, chapter 8. Michael A. Sheehan, who wrote in his 2008 book, Crush the Cell, How to Defeat Terrorism Without Terrorizing Ourselves. Sounds like a good name for a book. We mustn't overreact. It's in our national best interest to simply get over it. He had a point. In the US, each year, more than 30,000 people are killed in road crashes and more than 45,000 die from gun-related injuries. But they don't all occur on the same day, so these deaths do not generate outrage, and they are accepted by society with pragmatism rather than moral panic. And no better than to come to an American for the comment on this. Patricia, what do you think? And having been in the FBI for 30 years, what do you make of it?
Well, the comment does make sense, Yo-Yo. I don't know Mr. Sheehan's background, but, speaking from the background that I had, I can relate to a lot of what Mike talked about in the book because he and I had some parallel experiences in law enforcement. I believe he references working on a task force in the UK, and I also did that. In fact, 9/11 was the catalyst to move me out of the intel field into the terrorism world. But, moral panic. You mentioned moral panic, Yo-Yo, and yes, eh, COVID, to Farah's earlier point, also demonstrates how people respond when it affects you personally. And it also impacted society because what happened when the first strain of COVID hit, people were dying. We had the medical profession was hit in a way that I could never have imagined. And I have a brother who's a doctor. So I was concerned as a sister. But I also feel that from a security point of view, that what 9/11 did from that perspective is that it focused our attention on two things that had not been focused on before. And again, this is from the FBI perspective, my perspective. One was we started at the FBI to really shift, and all of a sudden, we focused on intelligence. Okay. In the beginning of my career, I was investigating bank robbers. I was investigating white collar criminals. And then what happens is everything changed. And the Bureau now, the focus is obviously on many things today, but terrorism took a front seat. So for me, my understanding, and again, I think Mike did a great job weaving in a lot of his own personal experiences as events were unfolding. And I think the reader will really gain really good insights as to, again, his UK perspective, but also his perspective on U.S. intelligence organizations, including the FBI.
Yep, very good. And your FBI experience is phenomenal to be able to draw a good perspective on this subject matter. And that's why I really wanted you here because it's important to have Americans in the debate of this book. Let's go over to you now, Chris, for your comments.
It's a topic I've spent a lot of time thinking about over the years. And where I usually land is, and I think it's illustrated well in this book, terrorism and society, it feels like a very classic security dilemma. And what I mean by that is, hey, my neighbor builds a fence, so I feel threatened, so I need to build a fence. Once I build a fence, then my neighbor goes back and now they're getting a guard dog. So now I guard dog. And there's this concept in the literature about that dilemma and where does it stop? And I think Philip Bobbitt actually is a director of the Center of National Security at Columbia University. He wrote a really great book on this a few years back. He called Terror and Consent. And one of the things that Philip talks about is that terrorism is not new. Its form adapts to reflect the type of society that it exists in. And so today, as Mike rightly points out in his book, with the access to information and accessible media, showmanship and performance is really an ultimate goal of a lot of the terrorist activity that we see. And so what I think one of the very interesting assertions that Mike makes in his book, and he talks about it very bluntly, is that oftentimes counterterrorism and politics have conflicting objectives. And he talks specifically about the concept of re-election. No politician will ever win an election saying you're safe enough, is one of the things Mike says in his book. Yet that totally flies in the face of the keep calm and carry on counterterrorism strategy that we saw in K during the Blitz and during IRA. And so I think, and now it's all about see something, say something, right? So we've evolved even further. But I think there's a really important conversation here, and perhaps it needs to be Mike's next book, on the topic of how do we marry security theory with measured political responses? And I suspect the answer lies somewhere in this idea of defensible understanding of both risk and opportunity. To use that age-old cliche, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. So we have to think really elastically about whether the response we're putting forward as security professionals is measured, and are we doing it in lockstep with the bodies that make the decisions around how we regulate and how we protect society.
I'm really glad you mentioned what you did, because I also see risk as opportunity. And I
Yes.
think it can't be seen as anything other than that, whether it's an opportunity for betterment or it's an opportunity to reduce risk.
I've had the privilege of implementing screening measures in a number of very unique contexts. And one of the comments that Mike makes in his book is, you'll never be measured by the threats that you didn't stop. And it's an interesting assertion, right? Yet one of the things I can tell you unequivocally, every time we implement security screening, whether it's simple or complex, we end up finding really interesting stories of other things that it's addressing as well. And so we can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. There is something to be said about putting appropriate measures in place. A great example is, we have this type of security apparatus in place in our airports. And now we're finding in the literature, it's actually been incredibly helpful in mitigating human trafficking. Interestingly enough, I've implemented security screening in other contexts where all of a sudden we're finding knives, left, right, and center, knives. We had no idea there were knives in that environment until we started asking the question and saying, what are we bringing into this space? And now we have a whole new set of data that we have to respond to. So, you can't connect that one control to a specific threat. That control may actually be doing multiple things that we either may intentionally or unintentionally be able to measure afterwards.
Thank you, Chris. Let's go over to you now, Deb. Deb, what's resonated with you in chapter 8 and 9 in the terrorism pieces in America?
Thanks, Yo-Yo. As an American, when I read this, I started thinking back to, as we always do, when you talk about 9/11, where were you at? What was happening at that time? And you never forget where you were. And so one thought that crossed my mind is, okay, so if the terrorists would have been able to hit the White House and we hadn't scrambled and canceled the flights, what would have happened? What was their goal? I mean, were they just disrupting our economy, just trying to send a message that, hi, yeah, we could do this? Or was it for money? Was it for fame? I don't know. But just those questions started going through my mind about that event that just changed everyone's lives. And, our security a lot of us wouldn't be in the field we are right now if it wasn't for that event, which is unfortunate to say, but fortunate in other ways. And a point that he brought up that really resonated with me is, since all these controls have been put into place with TSA or enhanced, because there was 20 controls that were already in place, they just enhanced them or bulked them up a little bit more and hired more people, added more technology, that there have not been any more terrorists taking over airplanes since 9/11. That was a comforting feature to know. But on the same point, as we talked about with that. You're more at risk to have a heart attack or get killed by a cow than be killed in a terrorist accident. Why the focus is on security for the planes, you're more apt to get hurt in a crash for a safety reason for an airplane, or maybe the maintenance wasn't done properly. So it still brings back that while things have improved, some of those other things are still the same. You can't control an engine going out or catching on fire on a plane. And again, that brings that safety, security kind of combination that's molded together into play. But since we're talking security, I'll stick on that part. One other thing that really, and I know Chris had mentioned this too, but the rise of the security of surveillance and privacy issues with all the procedures and technology that's come out of the 9/11, and why, personally, I don't mind. I don't mind being scanned. I don't mind my luggage being checked. I totally understand it because I would want other people to. And I know TSA used to put out a blog once a week that would say how many things and what things they gathered up from their surveillance. And I always laughed because it was just funny to discover people would buy like a lipstick that was actually a knife embedded in it or something just to see if they could get away with it. So it's quite comical to see what people were bringing on planes. But it's like, well, at the same time, I'm really glad they found that, because that could have saved an issue from happening. And so I can see the issue now with we've got drones, we've got cameras everywhere, we've got Edward Snowden talked about 10 years ago about surveillance of our text and audio and all of that. Where do we draw the line between privacy and duty of care for all Americans, all people around the world? And it is a fine line. It is a conversation that should continue to happen outside of this space. But honestly, I mean, I'm glad those procedures are in place and I'm glad they're finding what they're finding. And I think it keeps the honest people honest.
Deb, thank you so much. Adrian, when I read chapter 8 and I sort of relived, as we all did, how President Bush decided to take affirmative action, it suddenly dawned on me that even though at the time I felt that he was being quite hasty, and there was definitely a lot of resistance to proactive action overseas, especially in Iraq and Afghanistan, as a result of 9/11. But then I kind of thought retrospectively, if he hadn't taken any action, if he hadn't stepped in and made some pretty bold moves, whether we agree with them or not, his legacy would have been completely different. And I think he had no choice. With hindsight, I think he had no choice other than to assert the might of the United States in retaliation. So I had this new feeling about it, thinking, can you imagine if it was the other way around and no one was ever held to account? What are your thoughts, Adrian?
So I'm answer two parts. So to add to what most people said, definitely it had an impact on everyone. Prior to 9/11, I was going to be a farmer. So at that stage, I was actually in the US. When 9/11 happened, I went over to one of the local army bases, wanted to join the American Marines. They didn't want to take me because I've got a dodgy passport. But I ended up joining the British Army and deployed in 2004 and 6. But what you will never see on the news was the people coming to you on the streets to thank you for being there. So there was, from an ethical perspective, of course, there was something had to be done. And I think people will never understand the impact that happened. But so that's the psychological thing and that emotional thing that most of us can associate with. So one of the things this book definitely did was force me to read a significant more than the book itself. So I did quite a bit of research. I actually had some interviews with people in the US to confirm some of the statistics. And one of the things I don't agree with, Mike, is that 9/11 had an impact on security. It had an impact on state security, not on corporate security. So I looked at some of the statistics and there wasn't more corporate security managers being employed. What it did do was it created the two wars that we spoke about. So what does wars do? They drive innovation exponentially. So as an example, in 2006, I was using drones with a field-hardened tablet that had a direct satellite uplink with a drone that had a thermal imaging camera on it. And in 2006, you didn't even have iPads. but we had field-hardened tablets that can communicate to autonomous drones. So that technology that were created as innovation as part of the wars that happened naturally filtered down into the security industry. But those technologies are now coming to the forefront. But I wouldn't say that there was a specific massive impact on security perspective, but definitely on state security. And when state security gets mobilized, it filters down into corporate security. And I think that's something, I don't know, but yeah, there's definitely two issues to this. There's emotional side and there's definitely the technology side for me.
Okay, smashing. And Farah, just to finalize, what are your lasting comments?
I think this book is an absolute exemplar of meticulous, fact-driven discourse. What stands out most is Mike's commitment to grounding assertions in very well-researched evidence. The many references provided not only bolster the book's credibility, but also invite us readers into a deeper dive, allowing for a lot of independent exploration of everything he discusses, something I know Adrian really got into with it as well. It's not a passive read at all, but it's a springboard for active inquiry. And I think in a world where we are inundated with information, this sort of rigorous, reference rich approach is really refreshing and invaluable. Read it.
Awesome. Great. Thank you. I second that. I think you phrased it a lot better. Now let's go over to you, Patricia, for your final comments.
Thanks, Yo-Yo. Mike did an amazing job of going through history and really carefully researching what he was saying was occurring and how that impacted security and the perspective of how both the public, from a public viewpoint, from a personal viewpoint, from a security viewpoint. And so for me, what it left me with was the understanding that now the world is complex. We are global, whether you live in the UK or the US or wherever you live. Everything that I think about, because of the information I try to make myself smart about, is global. I have never been able to look just at what's in front of me, but I really want to widen the whole viewpoint and understand what's going on overseas, what's going on politically, and how it's impacting what I'm doing here in my role. And it's important, I think, for people in the United States just to do more of that. So for me, my understanding going forward and what this book has really helped me understand is that we are in a complex world, and the challenges that we're going to be facing going forward are going to be as complex as the world it is. And we look at Ukraine and Russia now, and I wonder what Mike would write about what his feelings are, what he's observed, and how he could draw parallels into today's atrocities going on over there. Thanks.
I really hope, Patricia, adding to those comments, that he does decide to write more, because I would definitely be interested to hear what he has to say. Chris, your last comments.
Yeah, well, I think it's really fitting that he starts the book on the African savannah, because I'm going to make an analogy here. He's provided a really well-written guided tour, and like a guided safari on the savannah, which is where his book starts, he does an exceptional job of identifying the animals. In this case, it's namely the issues facing our industry. And at times, he provides that really detailed historical context that we need to understand as security professionals. However, he wisely does not feed the animals or feed the issues by wrestling with them in detail in the book. So if you're looking for a great conversation starter on the big issues facing our industry, this is a fantastic, thought-provoking resource. But if you're hoping to find answers to some of the deep cultural problems facing our industry, I don't think that was Mike's objective, and you need to look for that resource elsewhere. In saying that, I really enjoyed this book. I read it over and flipped through it, and it made me start to think. And I think that was a great achievement that he's made there. It's a book written by a security professional for a security professional to help us understand our history, in hope that we won't repeat the mistakes of the past. I think that's what I'm taking away from this. And I think the reality is, with the multipolar world that we're facing right now and the landscape shifting as fast as it is, Mike calling us to be students of geopolitics and history, bang on, highly successful book.
Chris, I've actually got written here on a post-it note, a security book for security professionals written by a security professional.
Great minds think
That's
alike, right, Yo
crazy.
Yo?
Yeah. Great minds think alike. Stop
Right.
stealing my content. Thanks, Chris. So moving over to Deb. Deb, it's more than just, making good chat down the pub, isn't it? And saying that you've got more chance of choking to death on a pretzel than dying in a terrorist attack. As reassuring as that is, I'm a little bit wary of pretzels now.
Same here. But it's a great opening to a conversation. And I have to say, Chris's analogy of the African savannah, spot on. That was great. I thoroughly enjoyed this book. At first, I thought, oh, it's just another security book. But after I got into the first chapter, it drew me in. I wanted to learn more. I love the fact that he took all that time to research all the statistics. And then you listen, some chapters, he's like spitting out those statistics almost like bullets from an AK-47. And it's like, wait, stop. I can't take it anymore. I can't take, and then there's more. And then I think it offers a more impactful. You need to pay attention to these statistics because as Chris said, we need to know where we came from and why we came from in order to go forward. And I think every security practitioner should read this book. It should be required reading. It's a great opportunity to understand why things are the way they are, how they were developed, and where we're going. And I think in some of the chats that we had previously that it inspired us to do more research, as was mentioned before, to take a deeper dive, to look into other things. And personally, I haven't paid attention to political and geopolitical things, just like kept it on my eyes. But after reading this, it's like, oh, now I understand why I need to pay attention, why these are important, because it all connects and it impacts and influences everything. And I was just going to leave one more point. One item that really sticks with me that he mentioned early on was one of the earliest forms of security was a lock that was developed. We still use that tool today, the simple key and lock mechanism. And that was just profound for me.
Yes, and there's still some rather dodgy keypads still being used and using the password, 1, 2, 3, 4.
Uh-huh.
We haven't, in some cases, we haven't evolved as much. Thank you so much, Deb, and we'll certainly have you back. So let's move on then for our very final comments. Mr. Bosch, tell us what really resonated with you and we'll finish up.
I loved it. I think to know where you're going, you need to know where you came from. And Mike takes you on this absolute journey from the very beginning. And it's given me so much more context in terms of what we're doing in our profession. So I really enjoyed it. It leaves a lot of thinking points. So I really enjoyed it for that. It's really stimulated me to read more. And I'm really looking forward to a couple of coffees with Mike. We want to discuss some of the things that he's brought up. So yeah, no, really, I've recommended this book already to so many people. I really think if there's one you're going to read, you need to read this. It's definitely going to change I think it will influence the way you look at security in general. And I think that if anyone can do that with a book, then they've made a big success. So read it, go get it.
I'm also going to add that I think Mike owes you a coffee. And I would certainly say to Deb and Chris from Canada and Patricia from America, if you're ever in the UK, please tap up Mike for a beer, at least. Chris, bring over some maple syrup. Just wanted to say, final comments. Thank you all very much for sharing your opinions and views. ASIS International, Turning Pages Security Book Review. This is episode 2. We are so looking forward to episode 3, 4, 5, 6. We've already got a queue. I've got a pile of books ready to have a review team set at it. And we're having a lot of fun doing it. Check us out on social media. We are across Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, LinkedIn, and Threads. Like us, share us, comment. We'd love to have your feedback. And you can reach out to all of our guests in the review panel on LinkedIn, and we'll share their LinkedIn bios as well, so you can touch base with them afterwards if you want to. Thank you so much, everybody. See you next time.
Thank you.
Bye.
Oh, you look so good waving.